The gravel crunched beneath Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's boots as she stepped out of the rental car, the familiar scent of Iowa soil and diesel fuel filling her lungs. 3 months of flight training had changed everything about her except this moment of hesitation before walking up the farmhouse steps. The screen door squeaked the same protest it had since childhood, and her father's voice boomed from the kitchen without him even looking up from his coffee and morning farm reports. "You're back from playing with those expensive toys," Robert Mitchell said, his weathered hands never pausing as he circled livestock prices in red ink. Sarah's mother glanced up with apologetic eyes, the same look she'd worn through countless similar moments over the years. The kitchen smelled of bacon and disappointment, a combination Sarah had learned to associate with homecomings. Her dress blues hung upstairs in the closet, but today she wore civilian clothes, hoping somehow it might make this easier. Her father finally looked up, taking in her posture that 3 months of military discipline had straightened, the confidence that hours in a cockpit had built, the woman his daughter had become. None of it registered the way she'd hoped it would. "Hope you learned something useful up there," he continued, returning to his paper as if she were still 17 and coming home from summer camp rather than naval flight school. Sarah's younger brother Tommy burst through the back door with mud on his boots and excitement in his eyes. "Tell me about the Jets," he said, dropping into the chair beside her with the enthusiasm their father seemed to have lost somewhere between planting seasons. Sarah's face lit up as she described the roar of engines, the forces that pressed you into your seat, the moment when you break through clouds and see the world spread beneath you like a living map. Robert's newspaper rustled with deliberate loudness. "All that taxpayer money so you can joyride around the sky," he muttered, not bothering to lower the sports section. Sarah's mother touched her arm gently, a gesture that said both "stay calm and I understand," but Robert continued anyway. "Your grandfather built this land with his bare hands while real pilots were fighting real wars." The words hit harder than Sarah expected. She'd spent months learning to handle aircraft that could level buildings, mastering skills that demanded split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance, earning the right to wear wings that fewer than 2% of naval candidates ever achieved. But here in this kitchen, surrounded by the smell of coffee and her father's certainty, all of that felt suddenly small. Tommy's eyes never left her face, searching for the sister who'd written him letters about flying higher than eagles and faster than race cars. "Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there?" Sarah found herself wondering about others who might understand what it meant to come home changed only to find that home hadn't changed at all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cornfields as Sarah walked the property line she'd memorized as a child. Every fence post held a memory, every turn in the dirt wrote a story her father had told her about hard work and honest living. She understood his pride in the land, the satisfaction that came from coaxing life from soil and weather, but he refused to see the parallels in what she'd chosen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Commander Hayes about upcoming training exercises in the Midwest corridor. Sarah stared at the message, then at the endless rows of corn that would soon tower over her head. Two worlds that seemed impossibly far apart despite occupying the same sky. At lunch, Robert pushed his plate aside and leaned back in his chair with the satisfied grunt of a man who'd spent his morning doing what he considered real work. "Your cousin Mike's been running the Henderson farm since old Jim retired," he said, looking directly at Sarah for the first time all day. "Now that's a job with purpose. Feeding people, building something that lasts." Sarah set down her fork carefully, feeling the weight of her father's expectations pressing against everything she'd worked to become. "Dad, what I do matters too," she said, but Robert was already shaking his head before she finished the sentence. "Playing soldier is fine for a while, but eventually you need to grow up and contribute something meaningful to the world." That evening at Murphy's Diner, the conversation followed Sarah like a shadow she couldn't shake. Old Pete Harrison clapped her on the shoulder with genuine warmth, telling everyone within earshot about Robert Mitchell's daughter who'd gone off to become a pilot. The pride in his voice made her chest tight with something between gratitude and grief. But when Pete asked her to explain what she actually did, Sarah found herself stumbling over words that had flowed easily during briefings and training sessions. "How do you describe the responsibility of flying a $40 million aircraft to people who measure worth in acres harvested and cattle sold? How do you explain that protecting airspace requires the same dedication as protecting farmland, just from different threats? Mrs. Chen from the hardware store listened with polite interest, but Sarah could see the questions forming behind her eyes. Questions that sounded suspiciously like her father's voice asking why she'd chosen to play with machines instead of building something real. The town's respect felt conditional, waiting for her to prove that her choice hadn't been a mistake. Robert appeared at her elbow just as she was explaining flight patterns to Tommy's math teacher. "There's my daughter," he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, fresh back from her government vacation. The teacher laughed uncertainly, unsure whether to join the joke or defend Sarah's service, and in that moment of hesitation, Sarah felt the full weight of having to justify her existence to the very people who'd raised her to reach for more. The breaking point came during Sunday dinner when Robert's brother Jim joined them with stories about his son's promotion at the grain elevator. "Real advancement in a real job," Robert said, cutting his roast beef with deliberate precision. "Not like these military games where they give you ribbons for showing up." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate louder than she intended. "Dad, I earned my wings. Do you know what that means? Do you know what I had to prove to get them?" Robert looked up with the patient expression he'd worn when she was 7 and insisting she could drive the tractor. "Sweetheart, I'm sure it was very challenging for what it was. But at the end of the day, you're still just playing with expensive toys on the government's dime." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush the dining room. Sarah's mother reached across the table, but Sarah was already standing, her chair scraping against hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of family arguments. Tommy stared at his mashed potatoes like they might provide an escape route from the tension crackling between his father and sister. "Have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who refused to see it?" Sarah thought, remembering others who might understand this particular kind of heartbreak. Uncle Jim cleared his throat and changed the subject to corn prices, but the damage hung in the air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite go out. Sarah found herself in the barn later that night, surrounded by the familiar smell of hay and motor oil, trying to make sense of the anger burning in her chest. This was the same place where her father had taught her to change spark plugs and check tire pressure, where he'd explained that understanding machines meant respecting their power and precision. How could he not see that flying was just another kind of mechanical mastery, requiring the same attention to detail and split-second judgment he'd drilled into her since childhood? Her phone lit up with another message from Commander Hayes about the training exercise scheduled for Tuesday morning. Low-altitude navigation runs through rural corridors, practicing precision flying at high speeds over farmland terrain. Sarah stared at the coordinates, her heart stopping as she recognized the flight path that would take her directly over Mitchell family land at exactly 0800 hours. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his 13-year-old face serious in the dim barn light. "He's scared, you know," he said quietly. "Dad doesn't understand what you do, so he thinks if he makes it sound unimportant, maybe it won't be dangerous." Sarah looked at her little brother, seeing wisdom that somehow managed to coexist with grass stains and Pokémon cards. What would you do if someone you loved refused to believe in your dreams, she wondered, feeling the weight of a decision forming in her mind like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made every detail sharp against the autumn sky. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching her father load feed bags into his truck with the methodical precision of 30 years' practice. He'd be in the north field by 8 tomorrow morning, checking irrigation lines and soil conditions, completely unaware that his daughter would be screaming overhead at 600 miles per hour in an F-18 Super Hornet. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same attention to detail he'd criticized her for wasting on military precision would be what kept her alive during tomorrow's low-altitude run. Every system check, every calculation, every split-second decision that separated skilled pilots from smoking craters in farmland just like his. At breakfast, Robert announced his plans to spend Tuesday morning in the North Field, the same field Sarah had memorized from satellite photos during her mission briefing. "If the weather holds, I'll get those drainage ditches cleaned out before the ground freezes," he said, buttering his toast with the satisfaction of a man whose biggest concern was whether it might rain. Sarah nodded and poured orange juice with hands steadier than her heartbeat. "Have you ever kept a secret that could change everything?" she thought, watching her father plan his Tuesday morning routine, completely unaware that his world was about to shift at the speed of sound. Tuesday morning broke with the kind of perfect visibility that made flight instructors smile and daughters with something to prove hold their breath. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 0500, but she'd been awake for an hour already, running through pre-flight procedures in her mind and trying to calm the butterflies that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with the man currently drinking coffee 2 floors below. The drive to the airbase took 45 minutes through countryside that looked deceptively peaceful from ground level. Sarah knew that in 3 hours, she'd be seeing these same fields from a perspective that would compress miles into heartbeats, watching fence lines and farmhouses blur past at speeds that turned the familiar into something almost abstract. Commander Hayes briefed the squadron with typical military efficiency. Low-altitude navigation exercise, maintain 500 feet AGL, observe all civilian aircraft protocols, and remember that farmers get nervous when jets thunder over their livestock. Sarah nodded with the others, but her mind was calculating exactly how long it would take sound to reach her father's ears after she passed overhead. At 0730, she climbed into her cockpit and began the ritual that transformed Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from uncertain daughter into a weapon of precision engineering. Every switch, every gauge, every system coming online with the reliability her father had taught her to expect from well-maintained machinery, even if he'd never imagined his lessons applied to something this powerful. The F-18 Super Hornet roared to life beneath Sarah's hands with 44,000 pounds of thrust that could propel her from 0 to 60 faster than her father's best pickup truck could shift into second gear. Tower cleared her for takeoff at 0755, and as the runway fell away beneath her landing gear, Sarah felt the familiar transformation that came with leaving the Earth behind. At 500 feet above ground level, Iowa spread out like a patchwork quilt stitched together with county roads and irrigation ditches. Sarah could see her family's farm approaching in the distance, the red barn and white farmhouse looking exactly like the childhood drawings she'd sent to her father from school, back when making him proud seemed like the simplest thing in the world. Her GPS showed 3 minutes to target coordinates. 3 minutes until she would pass over the north field where Robert Mitchell was checking drainage ditches, probably cursing the morning dew that made everything slippery and wondering why the sky seemed so quiet today. 3 minutes until sound barrier physics would announce her presence with the kind of authority that left no room for doubt or dismissal. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, muscle memory taking over as she maintained perfect altitude and airspeed. The cornfields rushed beneath her wings like a golden river, and somewhere in that approaching farm was a father who still thought his daughter was playing with toys instead of mastering forces that could split atoms or level mountains. The moment arrived with the precision of physics and the impact of thunder. Sarah's F-18 screamed over the north field at exactly 0800 hours, 600 miles per hour of American engineering, announcing itself with a sonic signature that rattled windows 3 counties away and sent every bird within 5 miles scrambling for cover. Robert Mitchell looked up from his drainage ditch inspection just in time to see 40 feet of Navy fighter aircraft blur past at an altitude so low he could have read the pilot's name if the speed hadn't made everything except raw power impossible to process. The sound hit him a split second later, a wall of noise that seemed to originate from inside his chest and expand outward until it filled every corner of his understanding. He stood frozen in his field, mud on his boots and his mouth hanging open like a man who just watched his daughter casually demonstrate mastery over forces he'd never imagined she could touch. The jet was already disappearing toward the eastern horizon, but the thunder of its passage continued echoing off barn walls and grain silos, a sound that would replay in his memory for years to come. Mrs. Chen dropped her coffee mug on her front porch 2 miles away. Pete Harrison's cattle stampeded toward the far fence in blind panic. And Robert Mitchell remained motionless in his field, finally understanding what his daughter meant when she tried to explain the difference between playing with toys and commanding respect from the sky itself. Sarah's phone buzzed with incoming calls before she'd even completed her landing sequence back at the airbase. Tommy's voice crackled through her headset with barely contained excitement. "Sarah, the whole town heard that. Dad's just standing in the field staring at the sky. Mrs. Chen called to ask if that was really you flying that thing. Everyone's talking about it." By the time Sarah drove home 3 hours later, word had spread through Mitchell County like wildfire through dry grass. The girl who'd been fetching coffee and enduring patronizing smiles was suddenly the pilot who just demonstrated control over more horsepower than the entire county fair tractor pull combined. Pete Harrison was waiting in her driveway with questions about forces and turning radiuses that he'd never thought to ask before. But it was her father's face that stopped her heart when she walked through the kitchen door. Robert Mitchell sat at the same table where he'd dismissed her service as playing with toys, his calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold while he processed what he'd witnessed. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time in months, Sarah saw something in his eyes that looked like wonder. Share this moment with someone who needs to see what determination looks like, Sarah thought, watching recognition dawn across her father's weathered features. The man who'd spent his life coaxing miracles from soil and weather was finally ready to acknowledge that his daughter had learned to coax miracles from metal and sky. The words came slowly, like a man learning a new language after decades of speaking only one dialect of pride and stubbornness. I didn't understand, Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of every dismissive comment he'd made over the past 3 days. When you said you were flying jets, I thought. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what you'd become. Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table where she'd eaten thousands of meals and endured countless lectures about responsibility and hard work. The same principles he'd taught her, she realized, had simply found expression in a cockpit instead of a cornfield. Dad, everything you taught me about precision and attention to detail, about respecting powerful machinery and understanding that one mistake could cost everything, that's exactly what kept me alive up there today. Robert nodded slowly, his farmer's hands tracing the wood grain of the table their family had gathered around for 20 years. The thunder of that jet passing overhead had shattered more than just the morning quiet. It had broken through assumptions he'd carried about his daughter's choices, revealing capabilities he'd been too stubborn to see. That evening, Murphy's diner buzzed with conversations about the Navy pilot who'd grown up right here in Mitchell County. This reminds us that everyone carries hidden depths, Sarah thought, watching her father tell Pete Harrison about the daughter who could make 40,000 pounds of metal dance through the sky with the same gentle precision she'd once used to bottle-feed orphan calves.